So tuples basically do the same thing as lists. They store a collection or multiple items and associate those items with one variable. So now let's talk about the first difference. The first difference would be that when using tuples, you use round brackets or circular brackets opposed to these square brackets that you have for lists. And that is just about it. So if you know how to deal with lists, you can deal with tuples. So I do advise that you go back to my video, which I made, and I'll just link that on the top right. So visit that so that you have a background story of what we mean when we talk about collections and lists. So from that background information, I'm just going to do a quick juxtaposition, basically comparing the two. And I hope that would actually bring out what tuples are, but still referring to lists. So just go back to that video about lists and you should be good to go. So now let's get right into this new topic, tuples. You can call it tuples.py. Create a new file. There it is. Now we can use the exact same example using colors. That's what we used in the previous video when you're talking about lists, but I just want to switch it up a bit. So let's use capital cities. So let's call this variable capitals, and we're going to define a tuple starting with Pretoria, which is the capital of South Africa, which is where I'm from. It's not the only one though, but yeah, it's one of them. So let's think of another one. Let's say Brussels. That's a nice name, Brussels. And Nassau, capital of the Bahamas, and Accra, which is the capital of Ghana. And finally, Dakar, capital of Senegal. Now this is what we have, and these are capital cities. We've now associated all of these strings to the variable name capitals, just like we did with lists, but with colors in that example. And now I'm going to print this capitals. I'm going to print this tuple, and let's see what the output is. We expect a similar output in comparison to lists, and the only difference, as I mentioned, is that when dealing with tuples, we deal with circular brackets. So that is what we have over there. We have Pretoria, Brussels, Nassau, Accra, and Dakar. So that is all that we have, and that is what we defined exactly. But now let's check the type. This is a very useful operator. This is a very useful function. Just saying type around the name of the variable itself, and then printing that. So let's see what the type of this variable capitals is. If you go ahead and do that, you'd see that it says class tuple, which is exactly what this is. Here's a cool thing about tuples. You don't necessarily have to have these round braces. So you can omit both of them and it would still identify this as a tuple. So this is one cool thing. I'm not sure why you'd want to do this because it's quite confusing sometimes, but it's good to know this stuff. So as you see, it says class tuples, still a tuple. And if you want to output all of these values once again, just go ahead and do that. And look at that. Even though in the definition, we didn't have the round braces, and the output, they're over there. And that is because that is the basic definition of a tuple. It has round braces. So once you know that, you know how to define a tuple, just like we define lists, and you are basically good to go. Let's talk about some more differences with reference to lists. So I mentioned that you use round brackets. Another important difference is you can't add or subtract anything from a tuple. So if you define a tuple like this, then it's going to be like this forever, or for as long as you want to use it. So with lists, you could remove an element, you could insert, you could replace, and all of that stuff. So tuples are unchangeable. They are immutable. You can't change the contents of the tuples. Also, this order that these things appear in is the same order that you expect in the output. So the order of the elements will not change, and the content of the tuple itself will not change as well. So those are two other differences, or those are 2 points that you should note about tuples. And let's talk about similarities. If you want to access a specific element, let's say you want to access Nassau, which would be at the index 2. Remember that we always start at index 0, so that would be 1, that would be 2, 3, and 4. So at index 2, we have Nassau. And if you want to do that, you still use your square brackets, even though the definition of a tuple uses round brackets. When you access an element, you still use these brackets. So as our output, when we print that, we expect to get Nassau, and that is exactly what we have. Let's try using round braces just for the fun of it. And let's see what happens over here. So if you do that, you get an error because that's not how you do it, right? So now let's move on to another thing that we can talk about, tuples as well. Also allow duplicates, so you can also have another tutorial over there. That's perfectly fine. So we can allow duplicates, and it can have multiple data types, just like we did in the case of lists. And you can also find the length of the tuple, which is equal to the number of elements that are found in the tuple itself. So if you say length, you can find the length of the tuple. In this case, we have 5 capitals, and we expect 5 to be our answer. That is what we have. So these are quite similar to lists. The main difference is that you can't change the content of a tuple, and you can't change the order. If you define the stuff like this, it's always going to be like this. So one other interesting thing about tuples, if you define a tuple with one element, you have to have a comma after that one element. So let's put our round braces back. It looks better to me, at least. I'm going to put that back and also have one at the end over there. So if you want to define a tuple of a single element, I'm not quite sure why you'd want to do that, but if you want to do that, you can't do it like this. Let's see what happens when we do it like that. What does it say? Okay, so length, it says the length of this is 8. That doesn't quite make sense. There's only one element and it's a string. So what it's doing is it's counting the letters that are here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and they're 8. So it's taking this to be a string and not a tuple. So if you also change this to type, you'd see that it doesn't recognize that as a tuple, even though we want that to be, so it's a string instead. So if you want to have a tuple with one element, what you do is you put a comma after that one element that you have. And if you clear this and run the program, you'd see that it says it's a tuple. And if you print the tuple itself, or the length of the tuple, so we want to compare this with our previous output, if you run that, then you should see that the length is 1, and we have one element in the tuple. And if you print the tuple itself, so let's print the tuple, go to the end, do that, print it, should only say Pretoria. It's a tuple of one element. So make sure that you have this comma if you ever decide to have a tuple of one element, because if you have it like this, it will recognize that as a string. So this is all that I had to talk about with regards to tuples. I made a huge deal in terms of comparison, comparing these to lists. And so it's important that you know how to deal with lists so that your transition to tuples might be quite easy. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something of value. If you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video.